So the session, so basically built an enterprise app, right? It's an app for accounting consultants in the finance space. So it does a lot of processing of heavy amounts of data to present the financials. So there is some other interesting stuff, even for the folks who don't know SQL. So I think there's one person who says it might as well be a flavor of ice cream. But you will still find some interesting things. But if you have any questions or if you want to deep dive into any of those additional things that I've added to the app, I'm happy to connect offline and we can go through it in a little more detail. But I'll try and focus this session on more the functionality of the app, the complexities that I faced with like the just the native bubble do a search for that I've used, and then show you how the SQL implementation was. And I have to caveat, my app is on the dedicated plan, so it's on a dedicated server with Bubble. And so I have read access to my Bubble database through any SQL editor, right? So I can use I use something called Pop SQL to connect to my SQL editor, and I can see the database columns and tables and all of that. And so I can use that to test out the queries before I actually write it up in my app. But that's only because I want to access my own database within Bubble. But the SQL editor or the SQL plugin, the Bubble plugin for using SQL can be used on any external database. I think Bubble allows three different types of databases: Postgres, MySQL, and there's one more. So if you have an external database that uses any one of those SQL databases, you can always connect your app as well, and you'll anyway have read and write access. So just want to give a few caveats there. So a little bit of background about me. I've worked in analytics and consulting for 10, 12 years. And the last 8 or 9 years, I focused on the deal space. So divestitures, acquisitions, IPOs, that kind of stuff. And in those projects, I worked at PwC, and I saw that when there's a large acquisition or a divestiture or something like that, the buyer or even the SEC, if it's a public company, requires you to file historical financials. And so the consultants are brought in and we prepare these financials. And it's like usually done on this massive Excel file, right? With 30 or 40 tabs, with a bunch of consultants all working on the file at the same time, errors all over the place. And obviously, like anything changes, you sometimes won't see an error, but you might see the wrong number show up on the front on the financials, which you won't catch till the last minute. You just end up working late at night, working the weekends so that you can hit your deliverables on time, right? And so a lot of the big companies started automating these processes. And I found that except for the big four, which is PwC, Ernst& Young, Deloitte, and KPMG, all the others started building all the others still were using these massive Excel files. And so that's when I went into Bubble and I started building this tool. And I did that over the last year. But I've been building with Bubble since 2020. When the pandemic happened, I wanted to I've always wanted to build applications and start a company, but never knew how to. Always stopped at the wireframing stage. And then in 2020, I started learning Bubble and then built a bunch of different apps, like an NFT app, an app for immigration, an app for teaching kids entrepreneurship. None of those actually took off. And then I thought I'll build one in my expertise. And so that's what I built. And what the app entails, the background is consulting firms would basically download data from the customer's ERP system. So you have big Excel files with a lot of data, what they call the trial balance. They upload it into the app, which uploads it into Bubble. And then Bubble will summarize it and present it in the form of the financials so that multiple people can look at the financials at the same time. They can book adjustments to change numbers as they need to based on their discussions and look at these financials, right? So that's essentially what the app does. And because it's not a very complicated app in terms of like the individual functionality, it's more complicated than the data processing. That's why I started using SQL. And so what I can do now is maybe show you a quick run through of the app, specifically focusing on the area where the data processing is really heavy. And then I'll show you the contrasting sides on the editor. One is my live version or my main branch, which still has the old do a search for the native Bubble search. And then I'll show you the SQL implementation because I'm still working through it. It hasn't been updated on the entire app, so I haven't pushed it to live yet. So I can show you a contrast between the two. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Let me know if you're able to see my screen. Should be able to see it now. Awesome. Thank you. So once you log in, this is one of the other things because it's a finance app and I wanted additional security and stuff built in. So I've implemented multi-factor authentication. In my case, I'm using Google Authenticator, but you can use any sort of authenticator app, Microsoft or Authy or any of those. And Bubble has a native application for that. In your settings page, you can set up two-factor authentication and then set the whole thing up. So if anyone has questions on that, happy to talk about that offline as well. I'll run through the app really quick. So once you go into a project, the consultants would come in, set up the details around the project, set up how many periods they want to look at financials for, and then start uploading data, right? So I use another third party called Crafter to basically take in an Excel input and then upload it directly using the data API back into Bubble. And that way, the user doesn't have to upload CSVs like you would have to otherwise, right? With Bubble, typically you upload a CSV, but that's not very user friendly. So I've created a couple of workflows to upload data like this. So I have a template. All of the data is going to be blank, but it has a bunch of different columns, column headers, drop downs, things like that, and instructions. So the user can basically go into the app, download the template, put their data in, and then upload it in here. And then a tool called Crafter. So it's basically this. It create a bunch of automations, right? And you can go into this. If you want to learn more about Crafter, happy to talk through that later. I actually know the founder who did a fellowship with me a while ago. So he helped me set a bunch of this up. So that's really interesting to look at too, if anyone's interested. But basically, Bubble takes that data from Excel, figures out which row the data starts, and then imports it directly into the database, into the Bubble database, and passes results back to me. And the app does a bunch of checks in the backend to look for empty columns, blank rows, stuff like that. And so that's all the upload of the data. And then they can assign team members with different roles. So clients, team members, reviewers, admins, stuff like that. So once all of that's done and all of this data has been uploaded, that's when they can go in and look at the actual financials. And you see, it takes quite a while for the financials to load, right? And this is using a very small dummy data set, like it's very clean data, a few hundred rows, and it gets presented like this, right? The P&L and the balance sheet. And getting this view of the P&L and the balance sheet was the most complicated piece because it is a bunch of repeating groups that are nested within each other because the entire table has to be dynamic. All of these blue and white rows are custom. It depends on what the client uploads, right? What the user uploads. So in some cases, you might have revenue, cost of sales, and all of that. In some cases, you might have a row called sales. You might have a bunch of different rows, right? So the rows have to be dynamic. And then the columns also have to be dynamic because it's not the same periods they're looking at, right? They might go, now that we're in 2024, you might want to look at financials for 23 as well. Or they might want to go further back in time, look at FY19 or 18. So the columns are dynamic, the rows are dynamic. And then to add complexity, each of these can be drilled down further. And you click on it, you see how long this takes to load. That's because it's doing the native search, right? So it shows more detail that the customer has uploaded, again, at a period level and by individual line. So all of this was built with multiple repeating groups. There's more drop downs over here. There's subtotals at different points. So building this entire thing was really complicated. And so the way I built it initially to prove out that it is possible is using the native like Bubble features, get a few customers to use it and show it and see if there's actual value in it, and then got the dedicated server. You get a success manager who can help you build different things. And so he's been able to help me create a more optimized solution, which is using SQL. So I'll go into the Bubble editor now, but before we jump in there, were there any questions on on the app, or is there anything you want to go into in more detail before we jump in the editor? No, I can jump straight in. Okay. I'll go into the one other thing that I did have on the app is the ability to drill down, right? Which I haven't implemented in SQL yet, but I'm going to be doing that soon. So if you hit that refresh button there, the financials basically, you see how long it takes? It basically splits your financials by different columns. It's almost like a pivot table in Excel. where it splits the financials by all of these different fields. So let me go into the editor and show you how all of this works. Right? So this is what the repeating group looks like. I've got the P&L, just the P&L. I'll hide the balance sheet for now. And so this is the basic repeating group. But if you go into the details, you'll see that there's actually multiple hidden repeating groups in there. Right? So this is the entire structure that creates that entire view. So it starts off as like the overall outer repeating group is a bunch of these subtotals. So gross profit, operating income, net income, those are standard. So those are fixed. So at least I know that's where to start from. And that's the outer repeating group. And then inside, I have individual repeating groups for each of the other pieces. So I'll stick with just the high level, which is the FSLI or financial statement line item, which are these blue and white rows, right? Each of those has, again, for the columns, multiple repeating groups. So the outer repeating group is for the periods. So again, it's defined by the customer and by the user. When they decide on how many periods they have, that shows up there. And then inside that, I have an actual repeating group that aggregates the data, which is the do a search for, right? And this is the piece that was taking a lot of time. So when you do a search for, I have a table called summary trial balances, and then it does a bunch of filters, right? So project, period, FSLI, adjustment ID. So it's doing all of these filters, grouping it. And then and then there's conditionals as well, based on whether you want to look at it adjusted or not. There's another search. And then the actual cell inside the repeating group is basically taking that grouping, aggregated, and then formatting it. And then you have a couple of conditionals there as well. And so that's basically how this repeating group is created, right? I'm not even going into the details of the rows, but you see how slow that is. So I'll jump now into the SQL version of this and how I've implemented it in SQL. So this is in a new branch. Sometimes the page doesn't load when I switch branches and I have to refresh the page. I don't know if any of you have faced that issue as well. It's just coming up now. Cool. So in here, I've got a bunch of repeating groups, and this is the one, right? So you recognize this from the same view from earlier. So I have the repeating group, I have the header, and then I have those additional repeating groups here. So this is exactly what we looked at before. Previously, it used the do a search for, but now what I've got is if we once again look at just this row. So this is the FSLI row, which would be the blue and white lines. Actually, let me run the actual app as a user so you can see what it looks like on the front end. So if I go into the app, go into the financials, you see it loads a lot faster than the previous one. Even though this is a small data set, as the data set grows, it becomes hundreds of thousands of rows. The performance difference between the two will be very stark. So the traditional do a search for will time out after a little while, whereas this is a lot faster. So if I expand, again, the numbers show up pretty quickly, right? And this is just the speed for it to go back to the database, run the SQL queries, pull the data. So as data expands, the speed should remain more or less the same. Maybe it gets a little slower, whereas bubbles get progressively slower as the data increases. And so let's go back into the editor and see how this one was built. So I go into design. You see that now there's only one repeating group here. And in that repeating group, all it does is just has the periods. So it's like a very basic repeating group for which I'm still using the periods or like do a search for. And this isn't even the search. I've got this entire thing is a reusable element, and I've set some properties on the reusable element. So one is for project, one is for periods. So as soon as I load the page, it automatically searches for those and stores it as a property on the period. So that way I don't have to redo the search every time. So I'm referencing those values in the repeating group. So it's a very simple, quick repeating group that just shows the periods. And inside the repeating group, I don't need another nested repeating group. I just have a text field. And here's where I'm actually calling the SQL query. So I'll show you how I set up the SQL queries, but it's the same across the board. Here, I just have, and I'll put the chat on just in case people have questions. No questions. Okay. So in here as well for the account, the only repeating groups where I'm still doing a sort of search is on the outermost level where I'm actually searching for just the periods, just so that I get the columns lined up. Everything else inside is now a SQL query. So let's go into how we actually set up the SQL queries, right? So you need to install a plugin for this, and it's a plugin created by Bubble. It's called the Bubble SQL Database Connector. So once you have the database connector, there's a lot of information about the database connector and the Bubble documentation as well. And it allows a bunch of different databases. Like I said, there's MySQL, Postgres, and Microsoft SQL. So while setting this up, once you have your own database, in my case, it is the Bubble data, but in your case, any external database, whatever database you're using, you'll have a lot of different ways to get into your database, right? You'll have like a URL path, you'll have your host, you'll have your server name, your database name, username, and password. All of that is set up using this connection string. So Bubble uses a connection string to get all of that. So you see username, password, your URL, the port, DB name, all of that goes in there. Because mine's on the dedicated server, only if your IP is approved can you actually access it. So I'm okay showing this to you all. But the way I've set up the connection string is I've given it a name. You can select the type of database. This one's Postgres. And then you create this connection string. So once you've set up the connection string, you obviously test the connection. It tells you the connection's worked. And then you can go in and add your queries. So these are all the different queries that I've got, right? And so let's look into one of these queries. It's kind of like setting up the API connector for an external API, but specific to a SQL query, right? So you give it a name, you select the connection. So you can have multiple connections in case you're using 2 or 3 different databases. You can connect to whichever. So you set up your connection, and then you can use it as data or an action or both, right? An action would be as a workflow. So when you click a button, do an action, so write into the database or something like that. Right now, because I'm using the Bubble database, I don't have write access. It's only read access. And so I'm using it just as data, not really as an action. And then you come in and you write your SQL query here. So here I've got a really simple query. You saw in the previous one where I did the do a search for, it was like selecting 3 or 4 columns, grouping it by those columns, and then 4 filters, right? What do they call it? In constraints in the Bubble search. There were 4 different constraints. So in SQL, this is how you would write it, right? For those who are familiar with SQL, this is a really simple SQL script. I'm selecting 3 columns, 2 columns, and a sum. So I'm adding this amount. It's sort of aggregating it. I'm adding a bunch of conditions, and group by is aggregating across these different levels, right? So I want it aggregated by period and by row. So in the financials, it's by period and by FSLI, which is the row. So I want the total. My database might have 25 rows for each period and for revenue, right? As an example, revenue, FY20, there's 3 different accounts here. So for this account, there's this value. For this account, there's this value. And based on the number of transactions the company's had, you could have 20, 30, 40 different rows. I need to aggregate all of that into one row and then present it on the financials, right? And so that's basically what this query does. Aggregates it by period and by FSLI, and then presents it here and filters on 4 different parameters, right? And you would typically write a SQL query where you want the user to be able to provide, or you on the front end want to be able to make that SQL query dynamic, right? Where you want to provide different values that you can filter by dynamically. So very similar to the API connector where you use is it underscore star underscore, or like the 2 open and close brackets or something like that to denote to Bubble that it's a dynamic expression. The same thing you do here, but you use a dollar notation. So you can add multiple parameters. So in this case, I've added period, project, FSLI, and adjustment ID. And then I'm passing those in the SQL query as $1, $2, $3, and then $4, right? Don't worry about the specific functions here, like split part. That's basically for a type thing in Bubble. There's a specific way in which Bubble wants you to search for it in SQL. So I had to use a custom function there. And then same as like string to array, you don't need to worry about that if you're connecting to other databases. It's just something like a quirk of the way Bubble is connected to the SQL connectors built. But so basically you pass these parameters, and then on the front end, what that'll look like is when you query any of those SQL things that you've set up, it basically when you get data from an external API, you can provide the APIs here. And so these are all of my scripts that I've written, right? FO for financials overview, and then each of the queries for different levels. So this is the FSLI level. That's the query. All the parameters you've created, it gives you as dynamic data that you can provide. So here, period, I'm saying is current cells text because that's the column. Project is the overall project. FSLI is the group FSLI's text. So it's the row. So now the row and the column are allocated. And then you have the adjustment ID, which is something specific to this particular application. So don't have to worry about that. But once I pass those fields, then I can it's just a text element, right? So I'm rounding it and I'm just formatting it. Conditional as well, if it's thousands or not, I'm formatting it. So this now becomes a lot faster. And keep in mind, it's a much smaller data set, right? And it shows up a lot faster than the other. The thousands is basically this. So you can see the numbers as thousands. I'll show you with another test project that I had run where I uploaded larger amounts of data. So I uploaded about 2 or 3 times the amount of data, and the financials still load pretty quickly. It takes a few seconds initially, and then I go all the financials load at once. You can see the balance sheet is like huge, right? There's so much additional data here, thousands of rows. If I go into any one of these rows, you see how it expands. There's so much data on the back end that's all getting pulled into the front end, which with the do a search for something like this, I would click and then it just circles and it waits for like 5 seconds, 10 seconds, depending on the amount of data, and then it shows you everything. So the user doesn't get feedback either, doesn't know what's happening. It almost feels like the computer is hanging. But with the SQL connector, it works a lot faster. So that's the basic setup of the SQL connector. But just last night, I had a question, right? So if you look at the SQL queries that I've plugged in, there's some things you'll want to note, right? If you're using an external database like Bubble, you probably want to have like a dev environment and a live environment because you don't want to make errors in the live environment live, right? And so in Bubble, like you have a dev and you have live. That's how you, and here is how you actually call data from either one of those, right? There's two separate schemas within the Bubble database. One, in this case, my app is called solution test, and then there's solution live. So that's how you would query or tell Bubble where it's actually coming from, right? When I see there's a question here from Norbert, what is the format those queries return data to Bubble? So it depends on what you set up over here. So actually, I'll show you. That's a good question. If I update query types, if I click on update query types here, which is kind of like initializing an API call, it asks you the different data types for each of them, right? So by default, I think it puts text for everything. And so I had to go in and change it to number and then hit save. So that way Bubble knows what type of data to expect. And then on the front end, when you query that data, that's the type of data that it'll expect. So if it's expecting a number, and you provide a text, then it won't work. It'll show you an error. That is for the data that's returned, and for the data that's provided, where you pass the parameters, you set it up over here. So you're saying that these are going to be the text parameters that you're going to send. So you have all these options. You can have your option sets, or you have your basic types that the data can be when you're sending it. So going back to what I was saying earlier, one of the issues that I faced, right, I came up only yesterday, was not an issue really. It was basically this schema, because I'm testing all of this, making sure everything works before I push to live and I have live customers using it. And I'm using the test database. If I want to actually use it in the live version, I need this to be dynamic as well, right? Where I can say, if it's a live version, use solution underscore live. If it's the dev version, use solution underscore dev or test. And so I tried creating a new parameter and passing that data. So I'll show you what actually happens. If I create a new parameter, I call it, what would this be? Schema, database schema, give it option value text. Whoops, value text, and I call it solution live. And if I change this in here to $5, because that's the new parameter that I've created, right? You see, when I hit initialize query, it's going to give me an error. Database connector issue, syntax near $5. So SQL doesn't understand how to actually identify this. And so I reached out to, and I've got a bunch of issues now. So I'm just going to undo what I did. And hopefully issues will be resolved. Nope. Okay, I'll fix that later. But basically, this was the issue that I faced, right? Where I said, okay, issues resolved. I said that I'm going to need to change the schema from test to live based on what environment the user is in. And if I can't do it dynamically, how am I supposed to do this? And so the bubble person got back to me and he said that, well, you probably have to change it in here, push to live, and then for doing any further tests, come back in here and then change it again, right? Which if it's one or two queries, that makes sense. But when I've got so many queries, going into each one, making sure I've changed it, push it to live, come back to make changes, that doesn't really make sense. So just yesterday, my support person, he went in and he actually showed me a new query, right? And this is, again, it's specific to Bubbles database. So if you're ever in this situation where you're using Bubbles database, you could probably try this. But if you're using an external database, I don't think this should be a problem. But what he showed me was a specific Postgres function that I'd never heard of before. It's called execute dynamic query. And it's just one simple line of code, right? So select execute dynamic query from $1. So you're just passing one parameter as, and over here, P of, and you have to provide what the expected output is. So that's what column name and what type it is. And now in the text, you can actually send the entire code. So if I copy that script and I show you what that looks like in Notepad. Here. That's the entire query, right? Select amount, sum from here where 1 = 1, and all of this, right? This whole thing can be passed uh, as a string group by all this, right? So this entire thing can be passed as a string within this one query. So now this is something I'm going to test later today, where this one query can be used. And then when I go into the front end, I can pass anything I want. I can write the entire script up and pass it to this backend database as like arbitrary text. So what I'll be able to do if I'm using this bubble support, I haven't tried this before, so I just got this last night. But what I would be able to do, I'll just create a dummy text field somewhere here. Theoretically, what you should be able to do is get data from external API. And instead of picking any of these, I'll use the bubble support one. And the query is this query here, right? So I can just copy that query, or I can do arbitrary text. So that's easier to actually see the entire thing. You can edit it, you can figure out the queries from here. And then I should be able to run it, right? And what you get back is each item's sum of amount. And I'll just do sum. Now, if you refresh the page, you should have some number show up over there. Let's see. Nope, nothing showing up because I think I have to pass values in here. Oh, it's a different project. Well, like I said, I hadn't tested out that functionality yet. This is going to be the first time I'm going to try it out. But yeah, for some reason it's not showing the text here. Uh, Probably have to look into this a little bit more. But basically, what he told me is that particular query enables you to create whatever SQL script you want and then pass it from the front end directly instead of having to set up like 6, 7, 8 different scripts in here. You can just set this one as long as your output expected is the same, which in my case it is. And I'm always expecting a sum of amount, and it's always going to be a number. I can set this one up and then pass a bunch of different queries from the front end. So that's something I'm going to try. Once I find out, I can let you know if you're interested how it works. And yeah, that's essentially how the app works. Some additional, more complex things that I've built in the app. So there's something called an adjustment walk. Oh, I see another question here. What about additional costs for keeping the database on external SQL servers? And what about workflow unit consumption by SQL connector? Do you see the additional benefits? So because I'm on a dedicated server, that's got a fixed monthly cost. It's not based on workflow units. So I actually haven't been able to see whether workflow units would be increased or reduced. My assumption would be that performance is increased, but the workflow units would be reduced because do a search for is a pretty expensive query, right? In terms of workflow units, especially when you're doing a lot of constraints. I am not 100% sure, but I think it might be less, but the performance is definitely increased. So that's that's my understanding. See, Nathaniel has a question. You put your hands up. I
Hello.
unmuted you, Nathaniel, if you.
Hi.
Hey.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the talk. It's awesome. I'm also using SQL connector already on a project with an
Okay.
external database.
Okay.
But I was surprised we can access Bubble internal database. And is it only because you are on a dedicated server? Or
Yeah, so when you're on the dedicated server, you get read access to the Bubble
yes.
database, not write access. And so with the read access, I was able to actually, so this is my sandbox. I can go in and look at my different tables. So this is how Bubble creates the table names on the backend, custom $0 and then the table name, chart of accounts. This was the table that we were just looking at, right? Custom summary TB, and you can look at the columns. So I write some basic queries, test it out, see if it works, and then I go into the SQL connector. But actually, maybe you can help answer Norbert's question since you're using SQL with an external database. Does that reduce your workflow unit consumption and in terms
Oh,
of
good to
performance
know.
increase?
I didn't check that. I didn't check the workflow, the unit consumption. I don't know. But I know at the beginning of the W workflow unit, it was costly only to do a search for. It was consuming way too
Yeah,
much. And I know that they lowered the uh, token, the workflow unit consumption. So I'm not sure it's worth it. It's mostly because of the performance could be the main reason, I guess.
right.
And it's not that much. It doesn't cost that much to have an external database on some cloud providers. Um, but in the meantime, I prefer to have everything inside Bubble as much as possible.
Yeah,
Mostly the reason why we are going to Xano or even for storage also like AWS S3 or external services is mostly for performance reason. Um, so I guess it's a good. I really love the. It's a good reason to have a dedicated service server, but it's costly. It's very
it
costly.
is expensive. Yeah, because mine was it's a financial app where I'm working with consulting firms, and it's not even their data; it's their customers' data that they're putting into the app. So they become a little more cautious about the security
Yeah,
and also
data
performance,
security.
and so mostly for security. But just before we drop, I thought I'll show you this other thing that I built. Is very similar to the previous one, similar sort of financials, but you have this additional view of where they book all these different adjustments to adjust their financials, and you can see what they look like here, and then toggle them on or off and see their impact live on the adjustment. So this right now is still on the do a search for, and it still performs okay, but I'm waiting to implement the SQL and see how quickly it performs and how much better it is. I know we started a few minutes late and we're right at time, and there's a lot of other sessions, but were there any other questions or anything you wanted to look at in more detail? If not, I'd love to connect with all of you offline as well. I'm Gokul Madan on Twitter, um, at twitter.com/Gokul_Madan. But yeah, was there anything else you wanted to go into in more detail? Oh, there's a question there. Of the three platforms supported by Bubble, Postgres, MySQL, Microsoft SQL, do you know which, if any, have more user-friendly to adopt for someone new to SQL? Um, in the past, I've used MySQL a lot in my consulting days before I decided to go down the path of building this and focusing on this full time. MySQL is pretty straightforward. It's easy to use. Postgres, and I haven't used Microsoft SQL. I assume that's pretty easy as well. Postgres has a few specific functions, few different types of syntax, but mostly they're all very similar. They use the standard T-SQL, pretty easy to understand. Um, I know if you're planning to use an external database for your mobile app, if you have a startup, you can apply to the Microsoft for Startups program, and you get a bunch of Azure credits. I think you start with 1,000 credits, and if you use that in 6 months or 3 months, you can get 25,000 credits. And so if you want to use those sort of credits, if it's for a startup, it might make sense to go with Microsoft. But otherwise, in terms of learning curve, they're all pretty similar. Cool. Well, Nathaniel, I'd love to learn a little bit more about how you're using SQL as well on the back end, but I know we're at the end of time. So if you're okay to stay and talk about it, or if you want to drop for other sessions, maybe we can connect offline on
I
Twitter.
can just give a few bullet points.
Awesome. Yeah.
But quickly, it was because we built a hybrid application. There is a web application. It's a React web app, and on the back end we have a PostgreSQL and a Python backend API because it's for data science. So mostly it's Python language used, and we wanted to build a dashboard, but very quickly, just a fast MVP to have a dashboard on metrics for client consumption. Uh, we are building an application based on generative AI. So our customers are generating content for different kind of stuff, of products, and it can be costly. We are using OpenAI, and we wanted to have metrics on client consumptions to pay, also to have a pricing model more accurate for dedicated customers. And we had to connect to the backend database to retrieve and do some just quite simple calculation. So it's very easy with Bubble for that. We did the dashboard in one day. We had a great dashboard with uh, costs by people and in the with a timeline, and so for that Bubble is very great.
Awesome. And so do you use Bubble for your front end only for the entire application, and then all the back end is the external database, or is it the database is also hybrid?
Yeah, it's hybrid because we have a
Okay.
product which we have. Our product is an aggregation of different features, and some rely on Bubble. So we have data inside Bubble, and also, but some files are on AWS S3 because the data storage, file storage was not very uh, fine for us, not that smooth. And so as much as possible, we are using Bubble. But when we need kind of performance calculation, computation, we do it on a dedicated PostgreSQL because it's way better to do some heavy calculation or um, um, matching, because on AI we have to sometimes match, do some computation, and Bubble for that. I think they say this year they want to improve the data storage. And I think it's
Yeah.
because a lot of people are going outside. It's not that good
Yeah,
for
they've seen that. They're saying they're expecting it to be 10x faster sooner. The big, large
yeah.
data manipulation. I had a conversation with the person who was driving. I think they did release some upgrades to, I think it's the bulk data upload, a bulk data
Mm.
delete, and some of those functions. So folks who are on the dedicated plan, I think they were reaching out to them, those who had questions in that space. But my need was more to query the data and display it on the front end, not the bulk manipulate. So I just gave them some feedback on that being slow. But they said they were working on a big pipeline of stuff. So you're right, like it is going to get a lot faster, hopefully, soon. And that way we can stay on bubble a lot longer instead of thinking
Yeah,
of other alternatives and things like that.
that's one of the reasons to stay in bubble if we can wait. But for sure,
Yeah.
if in the next few months it's not coming, I think I will put my data outside as well.
Makes sense. Awesome. Well, it was great connecting with you. Thanks for your support, and look forward to connecting offline. If you have any questions on anything else you've seen on the app, like Crafter, where I used external APIs to load data directly in, or anything else that you want to look at in more detail, happy to connect.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. See
Bye.
you. Have a good rest of your week and the weekend. Bye.